The First War of Scottish Independence was the first of a series of wars between English and Scottish forces. It lasted from the English invasion of Scotland in 1296. The wars were caused by the attempts of the English kings to establish their authority over Scotland, while the Scots fought to keep English rule and authority out of Scotland. The relationship between England and Scotland by the 1280s was one of relatively harmonious coexistence. So much so that, in 1278, King Alexander III of Scotland paid homage to Edward, who was his brother-in-law, but apparently only for the lands he held in England. Problems arose only with the death of Alexander III. The heir to the throne was Alexander's his 3-year-old granddaughter and sole surviving descendant, Margaret, Maid of Norway. By the Treaty of Berghem, it was agreed that Margaret should marry King Edward's 6-year-old son Edward of Caernarfon, though Scotland would remain free of English overlordship. Margaret, by now 7 years of age, sailed from Norway for Scotland in the autumn of 1290, but fell ill on the way and died in Orkney. This left the country without an obvious heir and led to a period known as competitors for the crown of Scotland, or the Great Cause, with several families laying claim to the throne. Even though as many as 14 claimants put forward their claims to the title, the foremost competitors were John Balliol and Robert de Bruce, 5th Lord of Annandale. The Scottish magnates made a request to Edward to conduct the proceedings and administer the outcome, but not to arbitrate in the dispute. And with this, he insisted that, if he were to settle the contest, he had to be fully recognized as Scotland's feudal overlord. The Scots were reluctant to make such a concession, and replied that since the country had no king, no one had the authority to make this decision. This problem was circumvented when the competitors agreed that the realm would be handed over to Edward until a rightful heir had been found. After a lengthy hearing, a decision was made in favor of John Balliol on 17th November 1292. Even after Balliol's accession, Edward still continued to assert his authority over Scotland. Against the objections of the Scots, he agreed to hear appeals on cases ruled on by the Court of Guardians that had governed Scotland during the interregnum, in which Edward demanded that Balliol appear in person before the English Parliament to answer the charges. But the final straw was Edward's demand that the Scottish magnates provide military service in the war against France. And instead, the Scots formed an alliance with France and launched a failed attack on Carlisle Castle on 26 March 1296, to which was followed by a brutal English assault on Berwick, 30 March. Thus, officially starting war between the two countries. Throughout Scotland, there was widespread discontent and disorder after the English crown extended its dominion over Scotland, and in 1297, the country erupted in open revolt. Andrew de Moray and William Wallace emerged as the first significant Scottish patriots. Andrew de Moray, after being captured in the rout after the Battle of Dunbar in April 1296, was able to return to his father's castle at Avoch on the northern shore of the Moray Firth, where he raised his banner in the name of Scotland's king, John Balliol. Moray quickly gathered a band of like-minded patriots and began to attack and devastate every English garrisoned castle from Banff to Inverness. The entire province of Moray was soon in revolt against King Edward I's men, and before long Moray had secured the region, leaving him free to turn his attention to the rest of the northeast of Scotland. William Wallace, after leading an uprising against the English and killed the Sheriff of Lanark, famously called the Action at Lanark, rose to prominence in May 1297. When news of Wallace's attack on the English rippled throughout Scotland, men rallied to him, such as rebels who were supported by Robert Wishart, the Bishop of Glasgow, who also longed for the defeat of the English, giving his blessing to Wallace and his soldiers a degree of respectability, to which previously Scottish nobles had considered them mere outlaws. In early June, Wallace planned a symbolic strike to liberate Scone, the seat of the English-appointed Justiciar of Scotland, William de Ormsby. It was from Scone, a site held sacred by the Scots, that Ormsby had been dispensing English justice. But being forewarned of Wallace's imminent assault, Ormsby hastily fled. On hearing about the start of an aristocratic uprising, Edward I, although engaged in events in France, dispatched Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, together with his father's vassals of Annandale, to attack Douglas's stronghold in Lanarkshire. Whilst traveling north to face Douglas, Bruce began to think about where his loyalties truly lay. He decided to follow the Scottish cause, being quoted as saying, "No man holds his flesh and blood in hatred, and I am no exception. I must join my own people and the nation in whom I was born." Bruce joined the confederacy of men that included James the Steward, Robert Wishart, and William Douglas. After Wallace and Moray forced the English army in Irvine south of the Forth to retreat, only the castle of Dundee was left at their holding. While laying siege to Dundee Castle, Wallace heard that an English army was again advancing north, this time under John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey. Wallace put the leading men of the town of Dundee in charge of the castle's siege and moved to halt the advance of the English army. Wallace and Moray, who had recently combined their forces, deployed on the Ochil Hills overlooking the bridge crossing the River Forth at Stirling, and prepared to meet the English in battle. On 11 September 1297, Scottish forces met the Earl of Surrey's army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, ending in a Scottish victory that resulted on the clearing of the English out of Scotland. After this first key victory, Wallace turned his mind to the administration of the country. One of his early intentions was to re-establish commercial and diplomatic ties with Europe and win back the overseas trade that Scotland had enjoyed under Alexander III. But only 1 week after the Lubeck letter was signed, Wallace mounted an invasion of England. Crossing into Northumberland, the Scots followed the English army fleeing south in disarray. The Scots laid waste a swathe of countryside before wheeling west into Cumberland and pillaging all the way to Cockermouth, before Wallace led his men back into Northumberland and fired 700 villages. On his return from England, laden with booty, Wallace found himself at the pinnacle of his power. Being knighted in March 1298, and was appointed guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. In January 1298, Philip IV of France had signed a truce with Edward that did not include Scotland, thereby deserting his Scots allies. Edward returned to England from campaigning in France in March and called for his army to assemble. On 3 July, he invaded Scotland, intending to crush Wallace and all those daring to assert Scotland's independence. On 22 July, Edward's army attacked a much smaller Scottish force led by Wallace near Falkirk. Despite the victory, Edward and his army soon returned to England and thus failed to subdue Scotland completely. After the defeat at the Battle of Falkirk, Wallace's military reputation was ruined, resigning his guardianship in December, to which he was succeeded as guardian of the kingdom jointly by Robert Bruce and John Comyn, which brought another shift in the political situation of Scotland. The papacy also condemned Edward's invasions and occupation of Scotland in the papal bull Simus, Fili. The bull ordered Edward to desist his attacks and start negotiations with Scotland. However, Edward ignored the bull. In May 1300, Edward IV led a campaign into Scotland, invading Annandale and Galloway. With the success of the English at Falkirk 2 years earlier, Edward must have felt in a position to bring Scotland under full control permanently. The English took control of Caerlaverock Castle, but apart from some small skirmishes, there was no action. In August, the Pope sent a letter demanding that Edward withdraw from Scotland. Due to the lack of success, Edward arranged a truce with the Scots on 30 October and returned to England. It was some time after this last campaign that Bruce lost to support from Philip IV of France, and subsequently, the Pope. Since Philip faced revolt at home and became too involved in his own difficulties to care about the Scots, he thus created a schism between the Scots cause and the Pope, to which the Pope's support for the Scots faded without Philip's influence. It seemed that Philip had such difficulties that he signed a peace treaty with Edward that did not include any protection for the Scots. This act the Scots knew spelled their doom. Edward I, now free from embarrassment abroad and at home, and having made preparations for the final conquest of Scotland, he commenced his invasion in the middle of May 1303. His army, which was arranged in 2 divisions, one under himself and the other under the Prince of Wales, were unable to march through the west, but Edward reached Edinburgh by June, then marched all the way through Badenoch. Early in 1304, Edward sent a raiding party into the borders, which put to flight the Scottish forces. With the country now under submission, all the leading Scots surrendered to Edward in February. The terms of submission were negotiated on 9 February, with the laws and liberties of Scotland being as they had been in the day of Alexander III, and any that needed alteration would be with the advice of Edward and the advice and assent of the Scots nobles. After some months, while Robert Bruce outwardly maintained his loyalty to Edward, he was secretly advancing his own ambition, and, while assisting Edward in the settlement of the Scottish government, on 11th June 1304, Bruce and William Lamberton, the defender of Stirling Castle, made a pact that bound them, each to the other, in friendship and alliance against all men, signaling their commitment to their future perseverance for the Scots and their independence. They now intended to bide their time until the death of the elderly King of England. On 15th September, the English Parliament met with the Scottish representatives to decide the ordinances of government for Scotland. Bruce, as Earl of Carrick and now 7th Lord of Annandale, held huge estates and property in both Scotland and England, and had a claim to the Scottish throne. The pact which Bruce had made with Lamberton was not so secretly managed, and suspicions were awakened. This led to a conference with Comyn in which Bruce proposed that Comyn would support Bruce's claim to the throne and receive Bruce's lands as compensation, which didn't end up happening due to Comyn's betrayal, revealing the conspiracy to Edward. Bruce arrived in Dumfries and found Comyn there. At a private meeting with Comyn on the 10th of February 1306 at the Greyfriars Church, Bruce reproached Comyn for his treachery, which Comyn denied. Furious, Bruce drew his dagger and stabbed his betrayer, though not mortally, leading to his death at the hands of Bruce's followers. To which then, they forced the local English judges to surrender their castle, and Bruce realized that the dead had been cast, and that he had no alternative except to become either a king or a fugitive. He then went to Glasgow and met with the Bishop of Glasgow, and less than 7 weeks after the killing in Dumfries, at Scone Abbey on 25th of March 1306, Robert Bruce was crowned as King Robert I of Scotland. He then began a new campaign to free his kingdom, defeating the English in a number of battles. His forces continued to grow in strength, encouraged in part by the death of Edward I in July 1307. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 was an especially important Scottish victory, after which England lost control over Scotland. In 1327, Edward II of England was deposed and killed. The invasion of the north of England by Robert the Bruce forced the English to sign the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton on 1st May 1328, which recognized the independence of Scotland with Bruce as king. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. Stay curious, stay knowledgeable,